It was August 2003, a day after the bombing at the UN headquarters in Baghdad that killed 22 colleagues and friends, when I was first personally confronted with the fact that the UN blue flag was no longer viewed as impartial, and that, as such, we, the political side of this organization, were no longer immune to violence. Disoriented, injured, and shell-shocked, as I now sat in this haunted hotel by the loss of my colleagues and flogged by the media, my only thought turned to when I would leave this godforsaken country. Right then, outside my window, in his parting words, a young Iraqi kept raising his voice to get my attention. Please don't let the UN leave. If someone back then had told me I would return to Baghdad, I would have called them crazy, for the mere reason that I could not imagine a post-2003 Iraq, for the mere reason that I could not imagine what a role and difference a UN presence on the ground would make. Yet, I returned in 2007, and I began thinking about those very characters that shape the narratives and forge those narratives in war-torn countries where peoples are tried to recreate a nation and rebuild a state. The very diplomatic volunteers that by some crave adversity, if you may, and the very peoples that try to assist, who defy adversity, and for whom creativity stems from the very necessity to survive. So, when first asked to present under the theme, The Courage to Create, I paused. After all, what would a United Nations official, not least one working in conflict zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, have to say about creation? Places like Baghdad and Kabul invoke images of distraction, not creation. As for courage, it looked more like folly to others. My profession more viewed that of one adrenaline junkie, or even at best, someone with a misplaced romanticism a la Lawrence of Arabia or Freya Stark. But finding my scorched and shrapnelled UN blue passport, laissez-passer, from that August day in Baghdad, I began thinking and realizing it was more about having the courage to imagine a different narrative. Courage, for the former category of expatriates like myself, is less about physical risks. After all, I'm neither a troop correspondent, a war correspondent embedded with the troops, nor a soldier, not even a humanitarian aid worker. But it is about taking risks. It's about facing ethical dilemmas, fighting off tensions among the international public opinion, yourselves, our masters in the Security Council, and the very beneficiaries on the ground. It's about having the courage of conviction to navigate those pitfalls, fail time and again, and keep pushing. It's about being realistic about the structural constraints of a multilateral organization, its mandates, the interests of member states we try to serve, and even the structural constraints of an intractable conflict, and yet seek to find alternate avenues to leverage the very system and shape global policy. Some of the most creative and thus inspiring leaders I had the honor to serve under have defied those very structural constraints, often at the risk of personal detriment. In a seminar on UN leadership attributes last year, a participant commented that were we all to come back in 5 years' time and had received promotions, it could have only meant that none of us had taken any risks. For us, it is above all having the courage to relate, the humility to listen and make others listen. It is at the end of the day coming together to forge common narratives in places where the norm has been to deny the other, in places where the norm has been a zero-sum game of competing narratives. For the latter category, the very peoples, not the governments we are accredited to, is indeed about physical risk. It is physical risk for the Iraqi children that skip over IED or explosive-infested streets to go to school, that defy conservative fundamentalist warnings to attend a music, a ballet class. It is indeed physical risk to their well-being for the women of Afghanistan that defy an ultra-conservative tribal culture to go to secret schooling, for the female human rights activists that take on warlords. It is risk for the single female prosecutor in the country that takes on corruption at all levels. I may perhaps be unable to explain what I do. The most obvious examples of UN representatives are the UN blue helmets who enforce peace deals, or the technical experts that rebuild schools, restart clinics. Those are the images you're familiar with. What we call good office work, code for diplomacy, helping national leaders emerge to pull countries away from conflict, creating the space for all that need to be involved to come to the table to start a peace process, proposing solutions that national actors can adopt as their own. That work is largely invisible, mostly done behind closed doors, and by some sarcastically constitute nothing more than a series of meetings. So if I'm not able to share what I do, at least let me share what I see, and perhaps you'll find something to relate. After all, good office work is about people. Aerial images of Baghdad and Kabul look deceptively similar. But it only takes a widening of the lens to first detect the intractable Pamirs, topological difference that is, of course, or to zoom in and see the Mesopotamian palm trees. And I can only imagine what images you're used to seeing in the media. Iraq and Afghanistan have been reduced to being viewed from the prism of insurgency-driven conflicts and long drawn-out wars of the past decade. Their century-long civilization, now a condensed version. It is our job to look closer, to better understand. There are often false comparisons made of these two places because they're grouped together in the same category of international interventions of the past decade. Iraq has a long history of institutions and functions of state, a broadly educated middle class, a notion of citizenship, considerable wealth, a strong tribal base, but yet well-formed political parties, inter- and intra-sectarian differences, but yet a very strong Iraqi identity. Afghanistan, largely a Persian culture, with less pronounced sectarian differences, but distinct ethnicities and minorities, has a vast, inaccessible, and largely impoverished terrain, with long history of peripheral powers, strong local loyalties, and deeply rooted tribal, clan, and family networks, codes, and traditions. And yet, they share similar challenges in their political transitions. Both proud peoples, they're challenged to forge a national consensus, to gain control of their own affairs, reconcile their peoples, redress their grievances, build relations with their neighbors, and at the end of the day, try to regain a legitimate standing in the international community of nations, no longer viewed as a failed state gone rogue. And both face the constant dilemma of re-establishing order over dealing with justice. And they share similar aspirations. Both have experienced conflict fatigue. They have tired of civilian casualties. They ask the same of their governments: human dignity, citizens' rights, access to services. Both peoples will share in shaping the vision for the future of their countries. Some joys are even similar to youth elsewhere in the world. Iraqis love their football. Afghans have a highly competitive cricket team. Kabul boasts a pretty good, I must say, rock band. And the Skatistan project has brought young girls and boys alike skating in the sidewalks of Afghanistan. And women take part in politics. Some of the most vocal politicians in the Iraqi parliament are women. In the Afghan parliament, women hold 69 of the 250 seats. We can hardly point to a comparable example in our Western parliaments. And women take positions in the Air Force, TV, radio production, filmmaking, proving that in their campaign that if they can do it, others can too. In all this, Iraqis and Afghans have made sense, with a little bit of humor, of the absurdity of the militarized environments. They call larger Humvees, i.e. armored military vehicles like the one I'm standing in front of this picture, Humvees, mother of all Humvees. They are not faced at the sight of foreigners dressed in flak jackets and helmets, i.e. protective gear, entering their homes. The graffiti paint murals on concrete, what are called T-walls, that have altered the urban planning of their cities. And they have changed old military airplanes into an educational playground. And of course, I could go on with daily example of individual daring and ingenuity. And yes, they do things their own way. A former boss used to tell me, you can tell a lot about a culture by the national sport. This is accords.She, which is Afghanistan's national sport. I'll let you draw your own conclusions. But this is indeed where we need to pay closer attention. We cannot compress centuries of evolution in a single decade. It simply does not work. I'm not here today to paint a rosier picture of these conflict-ridden countries or of our role, the UN's role in it. But I would like to paint a more relatable picture. After all, it is our job to relate to all sides and to then provide face-saving compromise solutions, a ladder to climb down on for those who have boxed themselves in their political rhetoric, create space for dialogue and build the trust deficit. It is our job to try to harmonize the views of the international community, looking beyond short-term expedient agendas and keeping the long-term perspective. And naturally, expectations are high of us. We are at the very least expected to understand, if not empathize. As a Greek born in Thessaloniki, with family background both in Asia Minor and Greek Macedonia, I discovered to my wonderful surprise the power of relating. At the very least, Alexander the Great, his marriage to Persian princess Roshana, Hellenic civilization, and even our latest financial woes, have become conversational icebreakers, either when I'm drinking tea with Sunni sheikhs and Kurdish Peshmergas in Mosul, conversing with ulemas in Mazar and Herat, and tribal elders in Jalalabad or Kandahar, and even when I'm consulting with the political elite of Kabul. They have also had their recent encounters with the IMF, by the way. And empathy and compassion became the first step towards relating, the first step of navigating a personal and professional moral compass. And this is the UN's strength, not one of declaring an ultimate winner, but one of recognizing that more than one group can be right. It is not the resources, those we don't have. It is the legitimacy that we confer, the sanctioning of a narrative. Some may argue this very moral compass gets blurred in such conflicts. And I would argue back, yes, indeed, the paradigm of international involvement has become all the more blurred. But it is for the UN's political side to keep searching for a less messy solution, however ambiguous that looks at times. It is about achieving the best possible, not just the good enough. It is about bringing out the imaginative and daring in each and none of us for the greater collective good, putting aside personal and political agendas and getting involved precisely in those very places. As long as we're prepared to challenge the views and narratives of more powerful groups, if those are wrong. As long as we can see a different story. As long as we realize that it is the individual that makes a difference in any situation that is difficult and requires bold and out-of-the-box thinking and action. This is what the Iraqi back in 2003 was trying to tell me. Be present, have access, use your moral authority, listen, learn, voice. Voice a different narrative, sanction the aspirations of these people. He asked this of me, of my organization, with pride and courage. He asked of us to have the courage to imagine. Thank you.